Lucius Aemilius Paullus, Consul 219 and 216 BCE. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at one of Rome's most controversial consuls, and I'm going to be arguing that he deserves his fair share of the blame for the Battle of Cannae. Traditionally, most scholars have tended to blame Varro for the disaster at Cannae, but actually when we consider the source biases toward any patrician, and especially someone as well connected as Lucius Aemilius Paullus, we have to consider the possibility that maybe he wasn't quite as blameless as some of our sources like Polybius and Livy seem to try to argue. So that will be the main claim of this video. However, this is a more general biography as well, so we're going to look at Paulus's whole career. And this, of course, is the Paulus pause that I promised between my successor videos. So, let's begin the Paulus pause and look at the beginning of Paulus's life. There's a board game called Class Struggle, which is pretty funny if you ever get the chance to find and play it. And what it is it is effectively Marxist Monopoly. However, since it does have a Marxist interpretation of how a wealth game would work, you have to roll a sperm dice at the beginning of the game. And what this die roll determines is what class you are. If you're born into the capitalist class and you play as the capitalist faction, you have a 65 to 70% chance of winning the game under any circumstances. One time I played, I rolled capitalist, and even though I played very poorly, I still won the game. This is something that's fairly analogous to the life of Lucius Aemilius Paullus, or really any other well-born patrician. He is from the gens Aemilia, and this is one of the most prestigious patrician houses in all of Rome. His family claimed descent from Numa Pompilius, who of course is Rome's second king, and is generally considered, or at least was considered in Roman tradition, to be the inventor of the Roman religion. The Paulus branch of the Aemilia was first represented in the consulship by Marcus Aemilius Paullus, one of our Paulus's direct ancestors. And this earlier Paulus was consul in 302, and he defeated King Cleonymus of Sparta and then served as master of horse under a dictator the next year. So Paulus was both from a distinguished branch of his family and from a great gens. So while we don't know any of the details of his early life, we can assume that he had access to all of the best education and training that one could hope to receive, and that he was extraordinarily well connected through all of the various social networks in Rome at the time. As was very often the case with figures from the Republic, we only really hear about someone when they achieve a high office. And in the case of Lucius Aemilius Paullus, he only really enters into the historical record once he achieves his first consulship in 219. His plebeian colleague was Marcus Livius Salinator, who is pictured to the left. If you don't get the joke, then you can either learn Latin or consult Wikipedia. Take your pick. Anyhow, leading up to 219, Rome's policy had been to strengthen its hold over northern Italy and advance into Gallic territory. That had been something that people like Marcus Claudius Marcellus and others had gained fame doing. Back in 229, in a similar vein of Rome trying to control the areas that are contiguous with Italy, the Romans had invaded Illyria, which is on the other side of the Adriatic. It is on the Balkan coast. And they had fought the First Illyrian War. Predictably, when fighting a small power, the Romans were successful. They defeated Queen Tuta, and in the aftermath of that war, Tuta's power was undermined, and one of her subordinates named Demetrius of Pharos was able to take control. And Demetrius started off as an ally of Rome, but things soured, as we'll see. Part of the reason why Rome was able to win the First Illyrian War as easily as it did was because Demetrius was not a loyal subordinate to Queen Tuta. When she died in 227, he was able to seize control, largely because, as an ally of Rome, he could keep the Illyrians out of another war that they couldn't win. But in 225, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, he decided to take advantage of Rome's distraction in northern Italy to begin expanding against Rome's holdings and allies in Illyria. Of course, this is a pretty foolhardy move, since the Romans always hold grudges and always avenge any perceived wrongs. He also, though, I guess, realized that he was taking a big risk, so he started seeking out allies, including Macedon. Macedon at this time, under Philip V, was pretty powerful, and Macedon did understand that Rome expanding into the Balkans was a threat. Obviously, later they famously aligned with Carthage, even though Macedon didn't really get involved in the Second Punic War in any meaningful way. But anyway, Demetrius was not entirely insane, he just took a huge risk that ended up not paying off. By 219, Rome had dealt with northern Italy enough that they could spare troops to deal with Demetrius of Pharos. And they also, by 219, were aware of the threat potentially posed by Hannibal, and Rome was beginning to contemplate going to war with Carthage to prevent them from fully recovering. And before they went and did that, they really wanted to make sure that all of their flanks were secure. So dealing with the madman of Illyria was an obvious move from a Roman perspective. And of course, as the two consuls of the year, it fell to Paulus and Salinator to deal with the problem. So, feeling that northern Italy was largely pacified, which I'll grant is a feeling that was overly optimistic in the light of later events, Rome decided to send both consuls, Paulus and Salinator, to deal with Demetrius. Salinator had an army, and he was in the field, but we don't really know what he did. We don't know what battles he fought, if any. We don't know which cities he was responsible for taking. We just know that he was there. Paulus, however, we have plenty of documentation for, and we'll get around to looking at his victories momentarily. One thing to note is that part of the reason for the disparity in our knowledge of each man is that Paulus has descendants who are very well placed and who knew the historian Polybius, whereas Salinator doesn't seem to have left much of a legacy, and we don't hear of too many more Livius Salinators in Roman history. In the aftermath of their victory in the Second Illyrian War, we'll get to the details of the war in a little bit, both of the consuls were accused of criminally mismanaging the spoils of war, but only Salinator was successfully prosecuted. And if you've seen my video on Salinator, you know that he went into voluntary self-exile after this, and he was very disgruntled with the entire process. However, some scholars think that Paulus may have been equally guilty, but that because of his prestige and connections and also the victories that he was able to win and the spoils that those brought, that he was able to get his way out of this scandal and have the whole thing pinned on Salinator. I don't really know what the truth is in this matter. Certainly, Paulus had the resources and prestige to get himself out of a pickle like this, but chances are, if he was as busy as the sources say that he was during this time, he didn't have too much time for corruption, and he was most likely still busy leading his men. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but it's not really clear if he was or was not implicated in this misappropriation of the spoils. Anyway, let's move on and talk about what Paulus's great accomplishments were during the Second Illyrian War. Going into the Second Illyrian War, it appears that both sides identified the city of Demallum in Apollonia and the island of Pharos as being the two pivotal areas of operation. And much to the great fortune of Paulus, he was responsible for fighting at and capturing both of these places. So first he landed at Demallum in Apollonia, and he was able to storm the city after 7 days. This was far sooner than expected. If anything, it looks like Demallum was the primary target of the Romans, and so Paulus's victory here was a bit stunning. It massively advanced the timeline for ending the war. And then Paulus moved on to Pharos. I would actually speculate that perhaps Pharos was supposed to be reserved for Salinator if people thought that it was going to take a while for Paulus to reduce Demallum. Anyway, Paulus is able to get to Pharos without Salinator, And when he gets there, he sees that Demetrius has a well-fortified city and a reasonably sizable army. So rather than risking a brutal assault or a long protracted siege, Paullus comes up with a nice ruse. So he knew that because his army was larger than Demetrius's, that he wouldn't be able to lure him out to an open battle if he displayed all of his men. So what he did instead is Paullus hid most of his forces in the woods and then made a diversionary head-on assault with what looked like his full force. Demetrius saw this army, thought it was kind of small and that he could beat it head-on, so he sallied out of his city with the full force and tried to meet Paulus's army, and then Paulus's main force came out of hiding, and they overwhelmed Demetrius's army, defeated him in the field, captured the city, and this was a pretty easy victory, and it really cemented Paulus's reputation as an accomplished commander. Also, it's interesting that this was a somewhat Hannibalic approach to dealing with Demetrius, because he used troops hidden in ambush. That's something that usually Hannibal is credited for doing. But clearly this is something that was going on before that, and there were people who understood the value of surprise and of misrepresenting your forces to the enemy. So Paulus was certainly not an incapable commander, and he showed some degree of initiative at Demalum and then some degree of cleverness at Pharos. So, we shouldn't think that he's incompetent just because he happened to be at Cannae. That being said, I'm also going to argue that he shouldn't be let off the hook for Cannae, and that his decisions there actually do make some degree of sense. They're not completely idiotic. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Allegations of corruption aside, when all things are considered, Paulus's consulship of 219 was a textbook example of the kind of consular year that a Roman elite dreamt of. He had an easy opponent, he was able to win swiftly and not pass the war on to someone else who could take credit for it, and he won spoils. In addition, he won something that was considered to be one of the highest honors any Roman could achieve, and that is the triumph. To win a triumph, you have to defeat 5,000 or more foreign opponents of Rome in the field. And if we look at Demetrius's victories, they were bloody enough to meet this criteria, but at no point did Demetrius have to face anything like an existential threat. The worst case scenario from the Second Illyrian War is that the war would drag on and he wouldn't be able to finish it before his time was up, but there was no real chance that he would be defeated and killed or greatly disgraced by it, well, unless he had been convicted of corruption. Anyway, the end result of the Second Illyrian War, as far as Paulus was concerned, is that he was now established as one of Rome's best field commanders and as one of the most distinguished men in Rome. There weren't all that many people who had a triumph under their belt, after all. Not to mention, he was still relatively young, probably 40-something years old, and, he had every reason to believe that he would be consul again, although he'd probably have to wait 10 years or so. But that's fine. That's not an untypical thing. However, his timeline for getting back into office was advanced quite a bit by the outbreak of the Second Punic War the year after he left office. From 218 to 217, Rome suffered 3 defeats, one of which was catastrophic. Those 3 defeats, of course, were Ticinus, the Trebia, and Lake Trasimene. And in this trio of defeats, Rome began to seek wiser heads to lead them. And the Senate accordingly appointed a dictator in Fabius Maximus and his master of horse Minucius Rufus, and by pursuing a much more cautious strategy, at least in the case of Fabius, they were able to fare much better after Trasimene and into the early months of 216. So they won some skirmishes and restored morale. They also continued to rebuild the forces that had been devastated by Lake Trasimene. So while Rome had recovered a lot of its confidence, a lot of people in the Senate were now aware of the value of having a proven, experienced commander in the field when you're facing someone as cagey as Hannibal. And, of course, whose name would come to mind in 216 if you're looking for an experienced consul who has proven himself to be a capable general? Well, Lucius Aemilius Paullus. He had just won a triumph a few years before. So it should come as no surprise that when the consular elections were held, Lucius Aemilius Paullus was one of the men who was called back to service. Accordingly, in 216, Paulus was re-elected consul for the second time, and his plebeian colleague is the much maligned Gaius Terentius Varro. As I mentioned before, Roman morale had been shattered by Lake Trasimene, but by this point confidence in the ranks and among the members of the Senate had been restored due to the efforts of Fabius Maximus. In Plutarch, there's a tradition that Fabius Maximus had advocated for avoiding battle at all cost. However, that doesn't necessarily seem to have been the case going into the 216 campaign. Most Roman leaders by the summer of 216 recognized that a decisive battle was desirable and winnable. They had the numbers on Hannibal, they had the supplies over him, and his strategy of detaching Rome's allies was very dangerous and also very scary. At a blow, he could undo decades of progress that they had made in the Italian peninsula. So, they were very concerned to get rid of him as soon as possible, and this seems to have been the consensus of the Roman Senate and people, actually. So, there's no reason to think that Paulus was secretly opposed to seeking a decisive battle and wanted to drag the war out through attrition. If anything, I'm sure that he was just as eager as his colleague to seek this decisive battle. And now for the main event of Paulus's second consulship, the Battle of Cannae. This will, of course, by no means be a comprehensive view of the battle. For that, I think it would deserve its own video, and that is not something I'm interested in doing at the moment. So let's just talk about Cannae with a focus on Paulus's role and the challenges that faced him. So Paulus and Varro, as the two new consuls, were to be the commanders of this large army that was being assembled to crush Hannibal. The two of them raised 4 new legions to add to the 4 veteran legions under Geminus and Regulus. This gave them a total force of 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry. And I think many scholars have exaggerated how green these new recruits were, because just because they were recruited for this year's campaign doesn't mean it's the first time that they had ever served. Many of these guys had served. Rome tended to call guys up every single year. So while some of these guys were serving for the first time, that doesn't mean that most of them were. In fact, I imagine most of the men in the ranks had served at least once, maybe not even in a war, but certainly they were familiar with what they needed to do. The real problem, in my opinion, is that the Roman cavalry were not up to par with what the Carthaginians had, and this was an unwieldy force. No one had ever commanded an army this large, at least among the Romans. So even though you have several experienced Roman field commanders present, none of them had ever dealt with this kind of a situation. Because of the size of this army, Varro and Paulus understood that they would need as much help as possible guiding it. So the proconsul Geminus stayed with them to lead a significant portion of the men. Also, the former master of horse Minucius Rufus was there, and they had 48 total military tribunes. So these are subordinate officers responsible for commanding small units, possibly for serving as second in commands or deputies to the major commanders. It's not exactly clear what each of these tribunes was doing in the battle. However, when you have an army this large, you do need quite a few officers to keep the whole thing somewhat orderly, especially when it comes time to provide pay and, divvy out food and all of that kind of stuff. Another issue with this army is that you could get used to commanding it, but you would need some time to have it drill together and to get used to having that many men concentrated at once and trying to maneuver this unwieldy army. However, this army as a whole only assembled a week before the battle. So right as Hannibal was arriving at Cannae and seizing the supply depot there, this is when the new recruits under Varro and Paulus caught up with the existing troops of Geminus and formed the new Grand Army. So it's important to remember when we look at this battle that the army that fought at Cannae was only a week old at the time of the battle. At the time of the Battle of Cannae, it was normal practice when you had 2 consuls in command at the same time to have them alternate days of command. And what this led to is that later historians who were trying to vindicate Paulus could claim that all of the mistakes were made when Varro was in command, and that therefore Paulus wasn't culpable. On the day before the battle, Paulus refused to answer the challenge of Hannibal's skirmishers, but as Goldsworthy and other historians have pointed out, Paulus was in an unfavorable position to advance on Hannibal from where his camp was. The next day, when Varro took command, he moved across the river and got himself in a better position. So his advance was more sensible than what Paulus's would have been had he made it on the day before. And we don't really have a lot of evidence that Paulus was opposed to this plan or, tried to put his foot down against it. Both he and Varro had been inching toward Hannibal since they had arrived in the vicinity of Cannae. On the day of the battle, Paulus ended up commanding what is arguably the most important contingent of the Roman army during the battle, and that was the allied cavalry on the left. Varro was commanding the Roman horse on the right. The reason why the allied horse was more important is because this was actually the larger body. I believe there were 3,600 allied horse and maybe 2,400 Roman. And Varro on the left could expect, based on normal traditions of battle, to face the main striking force of the Carthaginian cavalry. So this meant that since Rome had the superiority in infantry but not in cavalry, that Varro's role in holding out against the main thrust of the enemy cavalry was pretty important. The plan for the Romans was to use their infantry to punch through the center and just hold steady on the flanks with the cav. So Paulus and Varro, respectively, were taking the number 1 and number 2 most difficult task upon themselves and leaving Geminus and Minucius and the others with the center to punch through. Paulus, of course, was defeated by Hasdrubal's Gallic and Spanish horse, who were generally better riders and also had a numerical advantage. Paulus was not deterred by this defeat, though, and he then went to the center where he was already wounded, but he kept urging his men forward. And this is exactly what a commander is supposed to do, to inspire his men to be visible, to keep his guys going, keep them in line. The problem with this is that Hannibal's plan was to lure in the Roman center to pull off a double envelopment. So, ironically, by doing the right thing, Paulus played exactly into Hannibal's hands and did exactly what Hannibal needed him to do in order for his plan to work. We have a dramatic description of how Paulus died, where now pretty wounded, bleeding, bloody, sitting on a rock, he is watching despondently as the disaster unfolds. One of his tribunes comes up and offers him his horse so that Paulus can attempt to cut himself out of this debacle, but Paulus refused and decided to die like a true Roman. Of course, how we would know if this is accurate or not is hard to tell, given that most of the Romans who ended up being encircled were killed, but it makes for a good story. And I have no reason to think that Paulus was a coward, because very few Romans were cowards when we look at their record on the field of battle. So this is actually a semi-plausible version of events, even if it is fairly fanciful, with all the imagery of this bloodied and battered man sitting on a rock watching the world crumble down before him. Anyway, so now let's talk about the blame game and the problem of source bias. So this leads to the question of whether or not Paulus is partly culpable for the disaster at Cannae. The narratives of Polybius and then even more so Livy really drive the narrative that the person at fault was Varro and that he was effectively solely responsible for the defeat. However, there's no real evidence that Paulus ever opposed engaging Hannibal or that he and Varro were at odds with one another. They seem to have gotten along fine. It was a time of national crisis. They worked together to raise 4 legions. They didn't have to compete with each other for office since one was a patrician, one was a plebeian. We know that Varro was also very well connected with what you call the establishment in Rome. He gave speeches that were well received by a lot of the senior senators, so he was not some sort of outsider or anything like that. We also know that Paulus didn't engage while he was in command, but that's not necessarily because he was against engaging Hannibal. It was because he was in an unfavorable position, as I mentioned earlier. When Varro led the attack, he put the Romans on a narrower front in order to minimize Hannibal's cavalry advantage and to maximize the impact of the infantry assault by the Romans, which, while it did play into Hannibal's hands, it was a predictable, tactically sound Roman move. And part of the problem when you're dealing with a military genius like Hannibal is that if you do something by the book, he can anticipate that and counter it very easily. And that's really, I think, where the fault lies. You don't ever fight a military genius with predictable tactics. You will always lose doing that. And neither Paulus nor Varro got very creative, and part of that, I think, is because they were wielding these massive armies that were hard to really command and control. I would say that Paulus is every bit as culpable for Cannae as Varro. If we're going to assign blame to the consuls, I think that they should share it. They share it in command, and if Paulus had also done a better job, then Varro would have been in a better position to strike Hannibal. So I think that there is a good case to be made that Paulus is equally culpable. That being said, as I alluded to a minute ago, I think that the real culprits for Cannae are, one, Hannibal. Obviously, he pulled this off. He deserves credit. It's not because the Romans were incompetent. It's because Hannibal was really, really good. The other thing is Roman tactical doctrine, while very effective, was also very predictable. So if you know what your enemy is going to do, then you can take advantage of that, and that's exactly what Hannibal did. So I hope that I've made that point clear enough. I feel like I've repeated myself a bit, but at least you know where I stand on this issue. So now let's move on to the final section of this video on the legacy and legend of Lucius Aemilius Paullus. Paulus had a daughter named Aemilia Tertia, and she was lucky enough to marry Scipio Africanus, who escaped from the disaster at Cannae and went on to become one of the most famous Romans in all of Roman history. A son of this Lucius was named Lucius Aemilius Paullus Macedonicus, and he later conquered Macedon, which meant that he not only brought back Perseus's library to Rome, but that as a part of this campaign, he took the historian Polybius as a hostage from the Achaean League. And of course, Polybius is considered our best source for the Second Punic War. And his patrons were men like Paullus Macedonicus, the son of the guy who had died at Cannae, and he had his own family version of how this battle had gone. In his view, his dad had not been responsible for Cannae, but rather it was that damn Varro. Macedonicus' son was adopted by the Scipio family and became Scipio Aemilianus, and this meant that another person who was very close to Polybius, Scipio Aemilianus, also wanted to promote the men of his family. So despite the fact that his name is Scipio, and many people just think of him as being part of Scipio's family, they forget the Aemilianus part of his name, and that he also had another branch of his family, his biological branch, to defend. So between Old Man Macedonicus and Aemilianus, Polybius had a lot of people in his ear telling him that Paulus had been a hero at Cannae, that it wasn't his fault, and that he had been against engaging in the first place. I'm actually an admirer of Polybius as a historian, but I think that he was very clearly influenced by the men who were his patrons in Rome, and that he accordingly wrote an account that was very biased toward the patricians who fought during the Second Punic War, and especially toward Lucius Aemilius Paullus, who did a lot less to earn it than someone like a Fabius Maximus or a Scipio Africanus. All that being said, I do accept that, like all the other Romans who fell at Cannae, Lucius Aemilius Paullus did his duty to the end, and he died a brave and honorable death. So I think that in itself was enough of a legacy, and we don't need to try to pretend that he wasn't at fault to make him a brave and honorable man. Anyhow, that's all I have for you. This concludes the Paulus pause. When I come back next time, we'll be talking about Seleucus I Nicator.